In the heart of the Indus Valley, beneath layers of wind-swept sand and 4,000 years of silence, archaeologists in the 1920s unearthed something that shouldn't exist. The ancient city of Mohenjo-Daro, one of the great urban centres of Bronze Age civilization, contained a central zone where bricks had melted. Not cracked from fire, not weathered by time, melted, fused into irregular masses of glassy stone, as though subjected to temperatures exceeding 1,900 degrees Celsius, temperatures achievable only through extraordinary means. The discovery troubled the excavation teams. Standard explanations, fire, warfare, natural disaster, couldn't account for the pattern. The vitrification was localized, intense, and strangely reminiscent of another kind of destruction, one that wouldn't occur for another 4 millennia, the glassy trinitite found at nuclear test sites. Before you dismiss this as coincidence or misinterpretation, consider what sits in climate-controlled vaults 3,000 miles away. Clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks, baked hard by the Mesopotamian sun, and preserved by chance beneath collapsed temples. These tablets, written in humanity's first script, describe in procedural detail weapons that smash thousands, winds that kill without touching, and wars between beings called the Anunnaki that turn cities into dust. The texts are not vague. They provide names, locations, sequences of events. They describe consequences, plagues, poisoned lands, populations that vanished overnight. And across the archaeological record, from Scotland to the Middle East to the Indus Valley, we find cities destroyed by extreme heat, stones melted into glass, and destruction layers that mark sudden, catastrophic endings. This is not ancient astronaut theory. This is not pseudo-archaeology. These are real tablets with catalogue numbers, housed in museums, translated by scholars who dedicated lifetimes to understanding what the Sumerians actually wrote. The question we're examining tonight is simple but profound. What if these texts are not mythology? What if they are records? Wherever you're listening from, whether you're settling in for sleep in New York or Sydney, London or Los Angeles, take a moment to leave a comment with your location and the time. There's something grounding about knowing others are hearing this same evidence at the same moment, scattered across the globe, all contemplating the same mystery. The story begins not with theories, but with what exists, physical objects, verifiable facts, and it asks you to consider possibilities that challenge everything we assume about the ancient world. When kingship descended from heaven, the Sumerians appear in history like a photograph suddenly coming into focus. Around 3500 BC, in the marshy lowlands between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a civilization emerged fully formed, not gradually, not through slow cultural evolution. Within a few centuries there were cities with populations exceeding 50,000, monumental architecture, sophisticated irrigation systems, written language, mathematics, astronomy, law codes, and administrative systems that wouldn't be surpassed for millennia. This sudden emergence has puzzled historians since the field of Mesopotamian archaeology began. Most civilizations develop incrementally. You see the progression from simple to complex. With Sumer, we see complexity from the start. The Sumerians themselves had an explanation. They recorded it on clay tablets and inscribed it on stone prisms, creating what we now call the Sumerian king list. The most complete version sits in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University, a 4-sided clay prism measuring 8 inches tall, covered in columns of cuneiform script. This object, catalogued as Weld Blundell 444 and dating to approximately 1800 BC, begins with a statement that arrests attention. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu, not invented by humans, not developed through cultural advancement, lowered from heaven. The phrasing is deliberate and specific, repeated throughout Sumerian literature. The concept is that civilization itself, its knowledge, its structures, its governance, came from somewhere else, was transmitted to humanity rather than created by it. The king list proceeds to name rulers and their reigns. But the early entries are extraordinary. The antediluvian kings, those who reigned before the Great Flood, that marks a catastrophic break in Sumerian history, are credited with reigns lasting tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu ruled for 28,800 years, Alaujar for 36,000 years, 8 kings total, spanning 241,200 years before the flood. Mainstream scholarship interprets these numbers as mythological, perhaps representing dynasties rather than individuals, or symbolic of divine legitimacy rather than actual chronology. The conventional reading treats the king list as a political document created to legitimize later rulers by connecting them to an ancient, semi-divine past. But notice what the text doesn't say. It doesn't describe these early kings as gods. It lists them in the same format as later, historically verified rulers. The scribe who inscribed Weld Blundell 444 made no distinction between the mythical early entries and the later kings we can confirm through archaeological evidence. To him, this was one continuous record. Another version of the list exists, catalogued as WB62, a smaller clay tablet excavated from Lhasa and dated to approximately 2000 BC, making it the oldest known copy, predating the prism by 2 centuries. This older version contains the same antediluvian sequence, suggesting the tradition is even more ancient than the tablets themselves. Then comes the flood. The king list describes it with stark simplicity. The flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Again, that phrase. Kingship lowered from heaven. After catastrophe, civilization had to be restored, retransmitted. The Sumerians consistently portray themselves not as inventors, but as recipients and preservers of knowledge that predates them. The cities named in the king list, Eridu, Kish, Uruk-Ur, all exist. Archaeologists have excavated them. The temples described in Sumerian texts have been unearthed. When Leonard Woolley excavated Ur between 1922 and 1934, he found an 8-foot layer of clean clay separating the earlier Ubaid period from later Sumerian occupation. A flood layer, evidence that something catastrophic had indeed occurred, dividing history into before and after. Eridu, identified with the archaeological site Tel Abu Shirain, was first excavated by John George Taylor in 1855. Modern excavations by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed 18 successive temple levels, built one atop another over millennia, all dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom and water. The earliest levels date to 5400 BC, making Eridu possibly the oldest known city on Earth. What the excavations revealed was continuity. Temple after temple built on the same sacred site, following the same architectural principles, suggesting an unbroken tradition stretching back beyond recorded history. The Sumerians were building on something older, maintaining something they inherited. The king list exists in multiple copies, found in different cities, spanning different periods. The consistency across these versions suggests they were copying from a common source, now lost. What we have are copies of copies, echoes of an original that recorded events the Sumerians themselves considered ancient. And here's what pulls focus. The list doesn't just name kings, it describes their accomplishments. It records who built which temples, who established which cities, who brought which innovations. And among these innovations are things that shouldn't exist in the Bronze Age. Knowledge of planetary orbits, sophisticated mathematics, detailed astronomical observations, medical procedures, legal concepts. The Sumerians had base 60 mathematics, which we still use for measuring time and angles. They calculated the length of the year with remarkable precision. They had schools, actual buildings where students learned to write, to calculate, to read literature. Thousands of student tablets have been recovered, showing homework assignments, teacher corrections, standardized curricula, This wasn't primitive society slowly discovering the basics. This was advanced civilization maintaining a system, and according to their own records, they learnt it from the Anunnaki. The term appears throughout Sumerian texts. Anunnaki, from Anu, the sky god, and Ki, earth, those who came from heaven to earth. Not metaphorically. The texts don't treat this as poetry or symbolism. They describe the Anunnaki as beings who held councils, made decisions, assigned tasks, who could be angered and appeased, who had conflicts among themselves. The mainstream interpretation is that the Anunnaki represent a divine pantheon, mythological beings created to explain natural phenomena and provide religious structure. This reading is reasonable and supported by parallels in other ancient cultures. Every civilization creates gods. Every mythology explains the world through divine action. But the Sumerian texts have a quality that distinguishes them from pure mythology. They're administrative, dry even. They record who did what, when and where, with the bureaucratic precision of accountants rather than the poetic flourish of mythmakers. And when those texts describe conflicts among the Anunnaki, when they document wars, weapons, destructions, the level of detail becomes unsettling. These aren't vague descriptions of gods throwing thunderbolts. These are procedural accounts of specific technologies used in specific ways with specific consequences, which brings us to the weapons themselves. Devices the texts insist could level cities, turn stone to dust, poison lands for generations, weapons that speak, winds that kill without touching, fires that consume everything. The tablets describing these weapons exist. They sit in museums. They have catalogue numbers. And they describe something. The archive keepers. The clay tablets that preserve Sumerian civilization survive because of an accident of technology. Unlike paper or parchment, which decay, clay baked in kilns, or accidentally fired when buildings burned, becomes nearly indestructible. A document pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago, if properly fired, is as readable today as the moment it was written. This is why we know so much about Sumer, despite its antiquity. The Sumerians were obsessive record keepers. They documented everything: temple inventories, grain distributions, legal contracts, mathematical exercises, medical prescriptions, astronomical observations, and literary texts. Tens of thousands of tablets have been recovered. Hundreds of thousands more likely remain buried. But tablets are useless without translation, and translation requires decipherment of a dead language written in an unfamiliar script. The breakthrough came in stages. In the 1840s, British diplomat Henry Rawlinson scaled a cliff face in Persia to copy the Behistun inscription, a multilingual text carved into rock at the command of Darius the Great. The inscription included Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, all written in cuneiform. By comparing the known Persian with the unknown Babylonian, scholars cracked the cuneiform code. But Babylonian is Akkadian, a Semitic language. Beneath it, older and stranger, lay Sumerian, a language unrelated to any known linguistic family, a language that predated everything around it. Deciphering Sumerian required decades of painstaking work, comparing texts, identifying patterns, building vocabularies word by word. The man who did more than anyone to unlock Sumerian literature was Samuel Noah Kramer, an American scholar who devoted 52 years to translating Sumerian tablets. His work established the academic foundation upon which all later scholarship builds. Kramer's translations weren't speculative. He worked from multiple sources, cross-referenced contexts, collaborated with linguists and archaeologists to ensure accuracy. His 1944 work, Sumerian Mythology, presented the first comprehensive translation of major Sumerian religious texts. His later book, The Sumerians, Their History, Culture and Character, published in 1963, remains essential reading. Kramer wasn't promoting alternative theories. He was documenting what the texts actually said, and what they said was strange. Kramer translated hymns, prayers, legal documents, mathematical texts, medical treatises, and epic poetry. The legal code of Ur-Nammu, predating Hammurabi's more famous code by 3 centuries, revealed sophisticated concepts of justice and proportionate punishment. The administrative tablets showed complex economic systems, standardized weights and measures, trade networks spanning thousands of miles. But it was the mythology that troubled even Kramer. In translations and summaries of texts like Lugul-i Minatas, he described weapons with properties that didn't fit neatly into standard mythological frameworks. These weren't just magical objects. They had specific functions, specific effects, specific names and descriptions. The tablets containing these texts weren't found in one location. They come from multiple cities, multiple periods, preserved in multiple copies. This suggests the stories were important enough to be copied repeatedly, standardized enough to maintain consistency, and widespread enough to be known across Sumerian civilization. When archaeologist Leonard Woolley excavated Ur between 1922 and 1934, his team recovered the Royal Cemetery with its stunning gold artifacts that captured public imagination. But they also recovered something more valuable to historians, the city's library, hundreds of tablets, many documenting literature. Among these was a nearly complete copy of the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, a text describing the city's fall in devastating detail. The poem spans 436 lines divided into 11 songs. It describes fire consuming the city, a storm that kills, buildings collapsing, people dying in streets, but it also describes something else, a wind that brings sickness, that poisons, that makes the land uninhabitable. The University Museum at Philadelphia houses many of these tablets, catalogued and available for study. The text isn't vague poetry, it lists streets, names districts, describes specific buildings. This is documentation wearing the skin of lamentation. Kramer and other scholars established that these weren't isolated texts, they were part of a broader literary tradition. Multiple lamentations exist for multiple cities, Ur, Nippur, Uruk, Eridu. Each follows similar patterns, describes similar catastrophes, uses similar language, as though describing the same type of event, repeated. The electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, maintained by Oxford University, provides access to these texts with scholarly annotation. Reading them, a pattern emerges. The destructions aren't attributed to conventional warfare. They're attributed to divine weapons, to decisions made by the Anunnaki Council, to technologies deliberately deployed. In Lugul-i, the god Ninurta battles a being called Asag, using an arsenal of weapons. One of these, Shurur, is described as autonomous, a weapon that scouts ahead, reports back, speaks. It's called the Smasher of Thousands. The text provides details about its capabilities that sound less like poetry and more like technical description. The Babylonian era and Isum epic, preserved in 5 tablets and reconstructed from fragments found across Mesopotamia, describes the god Era and his weapons, called the Sebeti. These 7 weapons are described as having been created at the foundation of the cosmos, sleeping until awakened, capable of destroying regions. The text of Era is particularly specific. It describes Era wanting to renew his weapons, which had become dull during a long peace. It describes him manipulating other gods into leaving their cities unprotected. It describes the deployment of these weapons, causing fires that burn abnormally hot, storms that poison, populations that die without visible wounds. This text was popular in antiquity. Dozens of copies exist, suggesting it was widely read and considered important. Why would a fictional story of divine conflict be copied so extensively, unless it documented something people needed to remember? The mainstream scholarly interpretation, exemplified by Kramer and his successors, is that these texts reflect natural disasters filtered through religious understanding. Floods, earthquakes, plagues, conventional warfare, all reinterpreted as divine action because ancient peoples lacked scientific frameworks to explain catastrophe otherwise. This interpretation is reasonable. It's probably correct. Humans do attribute natural events to supernatural causes when lacking better explanations, but the texts themselves resist this reading in subtle ways. They're too specific about procedural details, too consistent across different cities and time periods, too focused on particular weapons with particular effects, rather than generic divine punishment. The tablets exist in collections around the world. The British Museum holds Atrahasis tablets catalogued as BM 78941 and BM 78943, describing pre-flood civilization and its destruction. The Louvre has Sumerian literary texts. The Vorder Asiatisches Museum in Berlin houses major collections. Yale's Babylonian collection contains hundreds of tablets. These aren't obscure documents. They're foundational texts, studied by every Assyriologist, translated multiple times by different scholars, who reach similar renderings of the original Sumerian and Akkadian. And what they describe across multiple texts from multiple sources is war. Not metaphorical struggle between good and evil. Actual war, with strategies, weapons, casualties and consequences that left marks on the land. The question isn't whether these texts exist or what they say. That's established. The question is what they're describing. Mythology explaining natural disaster, allegorical teaching stories, or records of something that actually occurred, filtered through the conceptual frameworks available to Bronze Age scribes. Before answering, consider what came next. The texts describe weapons, and across the archaeological record we find evidence of destruction that matches the descriptions. Stones melted, cities abandoned suddenly, regions depopulated overnight, destruction layers that mark catastrophic endings. The texts and the evidence exist independently. The question is whether they're connected. The seven who judge. The Anunnaki appear in Sumerian texts with the regularity of a recurring character in an administrative log, not as distant abstract deities, but as present, active beings involved in day-to-day governance of civilization. They hold councils, they make decisions, they disagree, they assign responsibilities and territories, and according to the texts, they came from somewhere else. The term itself is compound. Anu refers to the sky god, the highest authority in the Sumerian pantheon, associated with heaven. Ki means earth, Anunnaki, those of Anu who are on earth. The phrasing implies origin elsewhere and presence here. In the creation epic Enuma Elish, the Anunnaki are described as emerging after Marduk defeats Tiamat and establishes order. They're assigned tasks, some to govern heaven, others to govern earth. The text uses the number 50 for those above and 50 for those below, though other texts give different numbers. What remains consistent is the concept of division, of assignment, of deliberate organisation. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in tablets catalogued at the British Museum as BM 78941, BM 78943 and BM 80385, provides more detail. Before humanity's creation, the Anunnaki themselves laboured, digging canals, maintaining irrigation systems. The work was hard. The lower-ranking Anunnaki rebelled, refusing to continue. The solution, according to the text, was creating humans to take over the labour. This isn't typical creation mythology. Most ancient creation stories describe gods making humans from divine will or cosmic necessity. Atrahasis presents it as a labour problem. Humans are engineered to fulfill a function. The text even describes the process, mixing clay with the blood of a slain god, shaping it, bringing it to life. Procedural, almost technical. The Anunnaki in these texts have hierarchy. At the top sits Anu, the distant authority. Below him, his sons, Enlil, described as commander of earth, associated with wind and storms, and Enki, associated with water, wisdom and craftsmanship. These two brothers divide authority and frequently conflict. Enlil makes the major decisions. He's described as harsh, demanding strict order, willing to destroy humanity entirely when they become too numerous or too noisy. Enki, by contrast, is humanity's advocate. When Enlil sends the flood to destroy civilization, Enki secretly warns Atrahasis, instructing him to build a boat and preserve humanity. The flood story exists in multiple Sumerian and Babylonian versions, but Atrahasis provides the most complete account. And crucially, the flood is explicitly described not as divine judgment for sin, that's a later theological reinterpretation, but as population control. Humans multiplied too quickly. The noise disturbed the gods. The solution was elimination. Enki's intervention saves a remnant, but this act creates permanent conflict between the brothers. This conflict forms the background for much of what follows in Sumerian literature, a cosmic civil war between factions, between territories, between competing authorities. Other Anunnaki appear frequently. Ninhursag, associated with creation and healing. Inanna, the goddess of war and love, whose texts describe her travelling between cities, receiving worship, demanding tribute. Nergal, associated with the underworld and pestilence. Ninurta, the warrior, whose exploits fill entire epic cycles. These beings are described with specificity. They have family relationships, they marry, have children, form alliances. They control specific cities. Enlil's centre is Nippur, Enki's is Eridu, Inanna's is Uruk. The texts describe their temples, their symbols, their rituals. Archaeological excavations confirm these temples existed where the texts claim, built according to the descriptions provided. This level of detail is unusual for pure mythology. When texts describe Zeus or Odin, they're vague about practical matters, where exactly these gods lived, how their palaces were structured, what their day-to-day activities involved. Sumerian texts provide that information. They describe Enlil's temple E-Kur in Nippur with architectural precision. They list the offerings required for specific festivals. They name the priests who served there. The Anunnaki are described as having superior knowledge. Enki possesses the Mi, divine decrees or fundamental principles that govern civilization. These Mi include kingship, priestly office, writing, crafts, weapons, sexual intercourse, travel, music, art, essentially all aspects of culture. Inanna steals some Mi from Enki and brings them to her city, Uruk. The story reads like industrial espionage, not religious allegory. The texts describe the Anunnaki as long-lived, but not immortal in the absolute sense. They can be killed, though it requires extraordinary means. Tiamat, the primordial goddess, is slain by Marduk. The god whose blood is used to create humanity is executed. Mortality exists, but on a different timescale. And crucially, the Anunnaki are described as having weapons. Not just any weapons. Specific devices with specific functions. The texts name them, describe them, detail their effects. These aren't generic thunderbolts or magic swords. They're technologies. In Lugal-E, Ninurta's weapon Shurul isn't just powerful, it's described as having intelligence, autonomy, the ability to fly ahead and scout. It reports back to Ninurta about enemy positions. It smashes thousands when deployed. The Sumerian text uses specific terms for its capabilities that don't align neatly with metaphor. The Sabiti, the 7 weapons of Error described in the Error and Ishram epic, are called weapons of terror. They were forged at the foundation of the cosmos and placed in storage, dormant until needed. When Error awakens them, they're described as hungry, eager to destroy. They're not wielded like swords or axes. They're released, deployed, sent forth. These descriptions appear across multiple texts, multiple periods, multiple cities. The consistency suggests these weren't individual scribal inventions, but standardized traditions, stories everyone knew, details everyone accepted. The mainstream interpretation is that these are mythological explanations for natural forces. Shurur represents lightning or storm winds. The Sebeti represent plague or natural disaster. The conflicts between Anunnaki explain drought, flood, earthquake, natural cycles personified as divine conflict. But the texts resist this reading in specific ways. Lightning is mentioned separately in Sumerian literature. Storms have their own descriptions. Earthquakes are documented. The weapons of the Anunnaki are described as distinct from these natural phenomena. They're technological, they're controlled, they're deployed with intention. One peculiar detail appears repeatedly: the weapons require preparation. Marduk in Enuma Elish gathers his arsenal before battle: the 4 winds, the 7 winds, the net given by Anu, the mace Imhullu. This isn't a god casually exercising innate power. This is someone assembling tools for a specific task. Erra, in his epic, must first renew his weapons. They've been dormant during a long peace. They've dulled. They need to be made ready. He travels to retrieve them, to activate them, to test them. Again, procedural, technical. And when these weapons are deployed, the effects are specific, not generalized destruction. Targeted catastrophe. Cities burn with unusual heat. Populations die without visible wounds. Lands become poisoned, uninhabitable for generations. The texts describe aftermath: regions where nothing grows, waters that sicken, air that kills. These aren't typical descriptions of conventional warfare's aftermath. They describe something else. The Anunnaki, according to Sumerian records, had the means to cause catastrophic destruction. They had reasons to conflict among themselves, and they deployed their weapons during a period the texts consistently describe as antediluvian, before the Great Flood that marks a break in civilization. Whether you interpret these beings as gods, as mythologized natural forces, or as something else entirely, the texts agree on one point: they had weapons, they used them, and the consequences were catastrophic. The question becomes, do we find evidence of such catastrophe in the archaeological record? Do the physical remains of ancient cities match the descriptions provided in the texts? The answer requires examining not what the Sumerians wrote, but what they left behind. Weapons that speak. In the Sumerian epic Lugal-E, composed sometime in the early 2nd millennium BC, the god Ninurta faces a threat from the mountains. A being named Asaj has gathered an army of stones, personified minerals and rocks, and threatens the ordered world. Ninurta, warrior son of Enlil, must defeat this chaos and restore order. The text, preserved in multiple copies and available through the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature maintained by Oxford University, describes Ninurta's preparation for battle. He doesn't simply charge into combat relying on divine strength. He assembles an arsenal. And the first weapon he consults is called Shurur. The name means smasher of thousands. It's written in Sumerian as a compound term that appears in multiple contexts across Sumerian literature. Shurur isn't described as an ordinary weapon. It's called a mace, but its capabilities extend far beyond what a club can do. The text describes Shurur as having the ability to fly. It travels ahead of Ninurta, scouts the enemy, and returns to report. It speaks. The dialogue is preserved in the clay. Shurur addresses Ninurta, my king I've seen, and provides tactical information. This isn't poetic personification. The text treats this capability as functional reality. When Ninurta finally engages a sag, Shurur is deployed. The text describes it striking with such force that it crushes thousands of the stone army simultaneously. The impact creates shockwaves. Mountains tremble. The defeated stones scatter and fall, and Ninurta must later sort them, deciding which stones are useful to civilization and which remain cursed. This judgment of the stones forms the latter part of Lugal-E and is peculiar in its specificity. Ninurta goes through the minerals one by one. This stone shall be used for building, this for tools, this for sacred objects. This stone is cursed and must never be touched, as though radioactive contamination required procedural warning. The mainstream interpretation, established by Samuel Noah Kramer and reinforced by subsequent scholarship, views Shurur as mythological representation of destructive power, perhaps a metaphor for storm winds or military might. The talking aspect is explained as poetic device, the flying capability as literary flourish. But the text's procedural tone resists this easy classification. The dialogue between Ninurta and Shurur follows military reconnaissance patterns. Shurur provides intelligence, enemy positions, numbers, terrain. Ninurta adjusts strategy based on this information. The exchange reads like a commander consulting an advanced scout, not a warrior mythologically empowered by storm. And Shurur appears in other texts. It's not unique to Lugal-E. The weapon is mentioned in hymns to Ninurta, in references to his temple at Nippur, in administrative texts that discuss offerings to the god and his divine weapon. This consistency across genres suggests Shurur wasn't poetic invention, but established tradition. More troubling are the effects described. When Shurur strikes, it doesn't just crush or pierce, it shatters. The Sumerian term used suggests disintegration at a fundamental level. Stone armies don't just fall, they fragment into dust. The impact creates pressure waves that flatten terrain. Similar weapons appear throughout Mesopotamian literature. In another Ninurta text, he wields multiple weapons simultaneously: the mace, the all-devouring axe, the 50-headed club, the arrows that never miss. Each is named. Each has specific function. The texts catalogue them with the precision of an armory inventory. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved in 7 tablets and dated to the late 2nd millennium BC, describes Marduk's preparation to battle Tiamat. The arsenal he assembles is detailed across multiple lines. First, Marduk creates the 4 winds: east, west, north, south. These aren't ordinary winds. They're described as having specific destructive capabilities designed to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Then he creates the evil wind, the tempest, the hurricane, the 4-fold wind, the 7-fold wind, and finally the whirlwind. 7 additional weapons, each named, each functional. Marduk also carries Imhullu, described in the text as the flood weapon, an object that causes devastation through wind and pressure. The name Imhullu appears in other contexts in Mesopotamian literature, always associated with destructive wind force. Then there's the net, a gift from his grandfather Anu. This net isn't for capture, it's for containment during destruction. Marduk uses the winds to inflate Tiamat like a balloon, then shoots an arrow into her distended body. The explosion tears her apart, splitting her corpse into sky and earth. The creation of the ordered cosmos from defeated chaos. The level of detail matters. These aren't vague descriptions of divine power, they're tactical accounts. Marduk approaches from a specific direction. He uses winds to immobilize his opponent. He employs a penetrating weapon at the moment of maximum vulnerability. He completes the kill with finishing strikes. This is combat doctrine, and the language used to describe these weapons consistently emphasizes their artificial nature. They're not extensions of divine essence. They're objects created, assembled, maintained. Era's weapons, the Sabiti, require awakening after dormancy. They must be renewed, prepared, tested. This implies technology, not innate magical ability. The Sabiti warrant particular attention. The Era and Isum epic reconstructed from multiple fragments found across Mesopotamia and dated to approximately 800 B, though likely preserving much older traditions, describes these 7 weapons in disturbing detail. They're called unrivaled warriors, flames of fire, carriers of death. They're described as having been forged at the foundation of the cosmos, placed in a specific location and kept dormant until needed. When Era decides to deploy them, he must travel to retrieve them. They're stored somewhere. They must be accessed. Once awakened, the Sebeti are described as eager to destroy, as though they have agency or autonomous function. They rise up when summoned. They cannot be turned back once released. This doesn't sound like a warrior picking up a sword. It sounds like activating weapon systems, and the effects when they're deployed are specific and disturbing. The text describes cities burning with abnormal heat, populations dying without visible injury, lands becoming barren, poisoned for generations, water sources contaminated, animals fleeing regions never to return. One passage describes survivors emerging from shelters after Era's attack, finding their cities destroyed, but the destruction localized. Some areas utterly annihilated, others nearby relatively untouched. This pattern doesn't match conventional warfare or natural disaster. It matches targeted deployment of extraordinary weapons. The consistency across these texts is remarkable. Whether Sumerian Lugal-E, Akkadian Enuma Elish, or Babylonian Era and Ishram, the pattern remains: named weapons, specific functions, procedural deployment, unusual effects. Could these be mythologized natural phenomena, lightning given narrative form, earthquakes personified as divine weapons? Possibly. Natural disasters do target specific areas, do leave some regions untouched, while destroying others. But the procedural nature of the descriptions, the preparation, the storage, the activation, the tactical deployment, doesn't align neatly with natural events. And there's another category of Sumerian text worth examining: the Lamentations. These aren't epic narratives about divine conflicts. They're mourning songs for destroyed cities, and they describe the weapon's aftermath, the warrior god's arsenal. The figure of Ninurta dominates Sumerian martial literature. He's called the Mighty One of Enlil, the warrior who maintains cosmic order through force when necessary. Multiple epics focus on his exploits, and each reveals more about the weapons he wielded. In addition to Sharul, Ninurta commands what the texts call all-devouring weapons. One is explicitly named, an axe that nothing can withstand. The Sumerian term used suggests not just sharpness, but fundamental interaction with matter itself, a weapon that doesn't cut so much as unmake. Another text describes Ninurta's 50-headed mace. The number 50 appears frequently in Mesopotamian divine mathematics, often representing completeness or maximum capacity. But taken literally, a 50-headed mace suggests not a club with decorative studs, but something more complex, multiple striking surfaces, perhaps multiple simultaneous impacts. His arrows are described as never missing, always finding their target regardless of distance or obstacle. Modern readers might interpret this as poetic exaggeration, but the texts treat this capability as technical specification rather than hyperbole. The arrows have divine essence, making them autonomous once released. The texts describe Ninurta standing in his chariot, itself depicted on ancient reliefs as a wheeled platform, though whether literally wheeled or symbolically represented is debated, hurling these weapons across the battlefield. The chariot is pulled by the great storm birds, creatures associated with thunder and described as having wings that darken the sky. Physical representations exist. At the Louvre, a Mesopotamian relief from approximately 900 BC shows a god, likely Ninurta or Marduk, standing in a wheeled chariot, bow drawn, facing a winged creature. The chariot's wheels are clearly detailed. The bow is substantial, larger than human-scale weapons. The god wears elaborate regalia suggesting protective gear, rather than simple clothing. This relief wasn't decorative. It was displayed in throne rooms, meant to communicate power and legitimate divine authority, but it also serves as visual documentation of how the Mesopotamians conceptualized these divine warriors and their equipment. Marduk's arsenal in Enuma Elish includes the winds already mentioned, but also a net of enormous size. The text says it was woven by his grandfather Anu and given as a gift. This net is used to trap Tiamat during their final confrontation. Once she's entangled, Marduk deploys the winds through her body, inflating her from within until she cannot resist the arrow that pierces her heart. The tactical sophistication of this sequence is striking. Entangle, immobilize, create internal vulnerability, exploit weakness with penetrating weapon, finish with final strikes to ensure death. This reads like special operations methodology translated into mythological language. After Tiamat's death, Marduk doesn't simply walk away victorious. He dissects the corpse, using different portions to create different aspects of the ordered cosmos. Her body becomes sky and earth. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and Euphrates. Her tail forms the Milky Way. This creation through destruction motif appears throughout Mesopotamian literature. Order doesn't emerge from void, it emerges from defeating and repurposing chaos. Violence isn't aberrant, it's foundational. The cosmos itself is built from conflict's aftermath. The weapons enable this transformation. Without Marduk's arsenal, Tiamat remains untouchable, chaos remains dominant, cosmos remains unformed. The weapons are therefore not incidental to the story, but essential to it. They're what makes order possible. Another Marduk weapon receives less attention, but appears in multiple texts: the evil wind. This isn't one of the 7 winds or the 4 winds. It's separate, specific, and described with disturbing effects. When Marduk releases the evil wind against Tiamat, it enters her body through her mouth and distends her from within. But in other contexts, the evil wind is described as a weapon that kills without visible injury, that moves like storm but strikes like plague. The term evil wind appears in the Atrahasis flood narrative, in the Era epic, and in various lamentation texts. It's consistently associated with mass death, with contamination, with making regions uninhabitable. The phrase becomes almost technical, a specific phenomenon that multiple texts document across centuries. These weapons aren't wielded recklessly. The texts emphasize that deploying them requires authority from the highest divine council. Marduk receives permission from the assembled Anunnaki before confronting Tiamat. Era must manipulate circumstances to gain opportunity for using the Sibiti. Even Ninurta, when battling Asag, is responding to a threat that endangered the cosmic order. This suggests restrictions, protocols, oversight. The weapons are so dangerous that even gods must justify their use. This detail is peculiar if we're reading pure mythology. Why would omnipotent deities need permission? Why would restrictions exist on divine action? Unless the texts reflect actual governance structures, actual restraints on weapon deployment, actual consequences severe enough that even the powerful hesitate before unleashing them. The effects of these weapons, when used, extend beyond immediate target destruction. The texts consistently describe aftermath, lands that remain poisoned, populations that don't recover, regions abandoned for generations. The Era epic explicitly describes Babylon being devastated and requiring centuries to rebuild. The Lamentation text describes cities that never return to their former glory, their very sites contaminated. This is not conventional warfare aftermath. Ancient armies could destroy cities, but the land recovered, populations returned, fields grew again. The destructions described in these texts have permanent or semi-permanent consequences that keep people away long after the conflict ends. What weapon leaves land poisoned for generations? What destruction makes regions uninhabitable, not through physical damage, but through some persistent contamination. The texts describe exactly this effect without explaining the mechanism. They document consequence without understanding cause. And across the archaeological record, we find precisely this pattern. Cities destroyed catastrophically and abandoned permanently. Regions depopulated suddenly with no evidence of conventional military conquest. Destruction layers that mark not gradual decline, but sudden, catastrophic ending. The texts describe weapons. The archaeological record shows destruction. Do they connect when Error walked the earth? The Error and Isium epic stands apart from other Mesopotamian literature in its unusual specificity about catastrophe. Preserved in multiple copies found across Mesopotamia and dated primarily to the first millennium BC, the text describes events set in a much earlier period, the time when the god Error, associated with plague and warfare, decided to renew his weapons and demonstrate his power. The epic begins with Error dormant. He's been at rest during a long peace, his weapons sleeping alongside him. But his weapons, the Sabiti, begin to speak, urging him to act. They're described as restless, eager to fulfill their function. This peculiar detail recurs throughout the text. The weapons have agency, they influence their wielder, they desire use. Error is convinced, but he cannot simply attack. Babylon is protected by Marduk, the supreme god who rules from the great temple Esagila. For Error to act, Marduk must first leave Babylon. The text describes Error manipulating this situation through deception and flattery, eventually convincing Marduk that his divine regalia requires renewal and that he must temporarily vacate his city to accomplish this. This political manoeuvring matters. It establishes that even divine beings operate under constraints. Territories are protected. Jurisdictions exist. Power has limits requiring circumvention rather than direct challenge. This is governance doctrine, not mythological fantasy. Once Marduk leaves Babylon, Error acts. The text describes him awakening the Sabiti, commanding them to attack specific targets. The destruction follows a pattern. Cities burn, populations die en masse, lands become barren. But the text provides disturbing details about the mechanism. The Sabiti are described as moving through cities like wind. They aren't striking with visible weapons. People die without injury, collapsing in streets. Buildings burn with unusual intensity. The heat is described as abnormal. Structures that should resist fire are consumed. Stone cracks. Metal melts. Isham, Error's advisor, tries to moderate the destruction. He's described as the voice of restraint, attempting to limit casualties, to protect some cities, to spare some populations. But once the Sabiti are released, they're difficult to control. The text emphasizes this. The weapons have momentum. They resist being stopped. They seek to complete their function. The aftermath is documented in detail. Babylon lies in ruins. The surrounding region is devastated. Populations flee and don't return. Fields lie fallow. Water sources are contaminated. A wind passed through that killed without discrimination. Warriors and civilians, livestock and wildlife, all fall. The text describes survivors emerging from underground shelters after the attack, finding their cities destroyed, but themselves inexplicably spared by having been below ground. This detail appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian flood or destruction narratives. In flood stories, people survive on boats. In earthquake stories, people survive by fleeing to open ground. But surviving underground specifically, while surface populations die, suggests exposure to something that didn't penetrate below ground level. Then comes the most disturbing section. The text describes the land remaining dangerous after Error's withdrawal. People attempt to return to cities and die. Animals that venture into devastated regions sicken and perish. Plants won't grow. This isn't described as divine curse requiring ritual appeasement. It's treated as physical contamination requiring time to dissipate. The epic includes specific geographic references. Babylon is named, the Tigris and Euphrates are mentioned, surrounding cities are listed. This geographic precision allows correlation with archaeological sites. And at several locations mentioned in the text, we find destruction layers dated to the late 3rd or early 2nd millennium BC, massive fires, sudden abandonment, long periods before reoccupation. The text explicitly states that this catastrophe was caused by divine weapons, not natural disaster, not conventional warfare, weapons deliberately deployed by error using the Sabiti. The text treats this as known history, not cautionary tale or theological allegory. At the epic's conclusion, Error himself seems shaken by what occurred. Isham reproaches him for excessive destruction. Error defends his actions, but also acknowledges the severity of consequences. He decrees that Babylon will eventually recover, but only after a long period. The text implies punishment for Error himself, limitations placed on his future actions, restrictions on weapon use, divine oversight implemented. This ending is peculiar for mythology. Usually, divine actions are justified and affirmed. Here, there's critique, there's consequence, there's suggestion that even gods face accountability for catastrophic weapons use. This reads more like historical documentation of policy failure than mythological affirmation of divine prerogative. The epic was widely copied in antiquity. Dozens of manuscript fragments exist, found at multiple sites across Mesopotamia. This suggests the text was considered important, perhaps as warning, perhaps as history, perhaps as both. One copy includes a colophon, a scribal note at the end, attributing the composition to a human author named Kabti Ilani Marduk, who claims to have received the text through dream revelation. Whether this attribution is accurate or conventional literary device, it establishes that ancient readers understood the text as documented tradition rather than creative invention. The Error epic describes what would later be called total war, not conflict between armies on defined battlefields, but deliberate attacks on civilian populations, infrastructure destruction, creation of uninhabitable zones. The weapons employed aren't conventional, the effects aren't temporary, the consequences force societal reorganization, and the text insists this actually happened, not in mythic time, not in allegorical space, but in Babylon and the surrounding region, causing devastation that required generations to overcome. Do we find evidence of such catastrophe in the archaeological record of Mesopotamia? Yes. We find multiple destruction layers, southern city abandonments, population collapses. Whether these physical events connect to the Error narrative requires examining the destructions themselves. But first, consider the Lamentations, texts written specifically to mourn destroyed cities, to document what was lost, and to describe how destruction occurred. Cities that wept in clay. The Sumerians created a literary genre unique in the ancient world, the city lamentation. When cities fell, whether to conquest, disaster, or divine judgment, scribes composed lengthy poems documenting the destruction. These weren't brief eulogies. They were detailed, structured compositions that described what happened with specificity that exceeds typical mythological or religious literature. 5 major lamentations survive, for Ur, for Nippur, for Uruk, for Eridu, and for Sumer and Akkad collectively. Each follows similar pattern: invocation of gods, description of abandonment by divine protectors, detailed account of destruction, mourning for what was lost, eventual promise of restoration. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur is the most complete, preserved in tablets held primarily at the University Museum at Philadelphia. Samuel Noah Kramer compiled 22 different fragments to reconstruct the full text, which spans 436 lines divided into 11 songs. The historical context is established. Ur fell to Elamite invasion around 2004 BCE, ending the Ur III dynasty. This is verified archaeology. We find destruction layer, sudden abandonment, evidence of military conquest. The lamentation was composed shortly after, documenting events within living memory. But the text describes more than conventional warfare. The first songs invoke the goddess Ningal, protector of Ur, describing her distress as she realizes she cannot prevent what's coming. The text emphasizes that this destruction was decreed by the divine council, specifically by Enlil and Anu. Ningal pleads before the council, begging them to spare her city. Her plea is denied. The decree stands. This detail matters. It establishes that gods who love their cities couldn't prevent their destruction because higher authority determined otherwise. This suggests hierarchical decision-making, strategic targeting, deliberate planning, rather than chaotic conflict or natural disaster. The fourth and fifth songs describe the destruction itself. A storm approaches Ur, but this storm isn't weather. It's described with details that don't fit meteorological phenomena. It moves deliberately toward the city. It targets specific areas. It kills everything it touches, but leaves other areas inexplicably unscathed. The text uses the term evil wind repeatedly. This wind carries something described as poison or venom that kills people, animals, and plants. Those caught in the open die immediately. Those who shelter underground survive slightly longer, but eventually succumb. The water is poisoned, food becomes inedible, buildings collapse, but not from siege or earthquake. The text describes heat so intense that stone cracks and wood bursts into flame spontaneously. The temple of Ningal, built of massive stone blocks, is described as melting. Then comes the aftermath. Survivors emerge to find Ur transformed into wasteland. Bodies lie in streets, piled like grain after harvest, showing no visible wounds. The river runs red, not with blood, but with something else. The fields won't grow, animals won't enter the devastated zone. The lamentation describes specific districts of Ur, naming streets and buildings. This geographic precision allows archaeologists to correlate the text with physical remains. And in the excavated ruins of Ur, Leonard Woolley's teams found evidence matching several details: massive fire damage, collapsed walls, and population that vanished suddenly. But Woolley also found something else. In certain areas of Ur, bricks showed unusual damage, not broken by force, but transformed. Surfaces that appeared glazed, stones that seemed partially melted. He documented these anomalies, but couldn't explain them with conventional fire or warfare. The lamentation for Nippur follows similar pattern. Nippur was Enlil's cult centre, the most sacred city in Sumer. Its destruction was spiritually catastrophic. The text describes how Enlil himself abandoned his temple before destruction arrived, reinforcing the pattern that divine protectors withdrew before weapons were deployed. The description of Nippur's destruction includes the storm that destroys the land, moving through the city systematically. The text describes buildings burning with fire that cannot be quenched, flames that consume even stone. Water poured on these fires makes them burn hotter, a detail that makes no sense for ordinary combustion, but accurately describes certain chemical fires. The lamentation texts were read ritually in temple ceremonies, performed annually to commemorate the destruction and pray for restoration. But they weren't just liturgical, they were historical documents, preserved in multiple copies, carefully transmitted. The scribes who copied them weren't inventing fiction, they were maintaining records. What troubles modern scholarship is the consistency across these texts. The lamentations for different cities composed at different times describe the same type of destruction, using the same unusual details: the evil wind, the abnormal heat, the poisoned land, the populations dying without visible injury. Conventional interpretations attribute this to literary tradition, later lamentations copying the pattern established by earlier ones, creating standardized destruction narrative disconnected from actual events. This is reasonable scholarly method. Ancient literature does follow conventions and reuse established patterns. But this interpretation requires assuming the details are purely literary rather than observational. It requires believing that descriptions of melting stone, poisoned water, and contaminated land were poetic exaggeration rather than documentation of actual effects. The texts resist this reading in subtle ways. They provide geographic specificity, they name witnesses, they describe aftermath that extends beyond the destruction itself: economic collapse, population dispersal, land abandonment. These consequences match archaeological evidence of actual societal collapse in multiple Sumerian cities during the late 3rd millennium BC. The Lamentations also connect to other texts. They reference the divine weapons described in epics. They mention decisions by the Anunnaki Council. They treat the destructions as deliberate actions within broader divine conflict, not isolated disasters. One lamentation includes a particularly disturbing detail. It describes survivors attempting to return to their city after the storm passed, but dying when they enter devastated areas. Their deaths aren't attributed to ruins collapsing or residual fire. They're attributed to something in the air, something in the water, something that persists after the visible destruction ends. This description of lingering contamination appears in multiple lamentation texts. It's not convention or metaphor, it's specific procedural warning. Don't return too soon. The land remains dangerous. Wait for it to clear. What leaves land dangerous after destruction ends? What contamination requires time to dissipate? What makes regions uninhabitable despite no visible ongoing threat? The texts document this effect without explaining it. They preserve observation without understanding mechanism, as though scribes recorded what they witnessed, even though it exceeded their conceptual frameworks. And this pattern, detailed documentation of effects beyond ancient comprehension, appears strongest in the flood narratives, where the catastrophe is even more extreme. The flood that wasn't only water. The Mesopotamian flood story predates the biblical account by at least a millennium. Multiple versions exist. The Atrahasis epic, the flood section of the Gilgamesh epic, the Eridu Genesis, and references scattered through other texts. Each provides slightly different details, but all agree on essential points: divine decision to destroy humanity, warning given to one man, ark constructed, flood unleashed, remnant survives, new covenant established. The Atrahasis epic, preserved in tablets catalogued at the British Museum as BM 78941 and BM 78943, provides the most complete account of the flood's context and mechanism. The text is dated to the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1800, though it preserves much older Sumerian traditions. Atrahasis establishes why the flood occurred. Humanity multiplied excessively. The noise of human civilization disturbed the gods. Enlil, commander of Earth, decided the solution was elimination. But Enki, who had created humanity, opposed this decision. Unable to prevent the decree, Enki subverted it by warning one human, Atrahasis, and instructing him to build a boat. The instructions are specific. The boat must be sealed with bitumen. It must be enormous, carrying not just Atrahasis and his family, but also pairs of every animal. It must be provisioned for extended survival. The detail level suggests these instructions were taken seriously, treated as technical specifications rather than vague guidance. Then comes the flood itself, but the text describes something more complex than simple water deluge. First, Enlil seals the water supply. Then he declares the storm will come. Multiple divine weapons are deployed simultaneously. Fires descend from heaven. Lightning illuminates the darkness. The earth trembles. Water rises from below, while rain falls from above. The text describes confusion of elements, fire and water together, earth and sky merging, order collapsing into chaos. The specific term used for the destructive agent is peculiar. The Sumerian A.Ma.Aru and Akkadian Abu refer to a cosmic flood, but with connotations beyond mere water. These terms carry implications of annihilation, of erasure, of unmaking at fundamental level. They're used in contexts that sometimes don't involve water at all. During the flood, the text describes the gods themselves fleeing, terrified by the destruction they unleashed. They cower like dogs outside the city walls. They're horrified by what's occurring. This is striking. Gods fearing their own weapons, unable to control what they've deployed. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it ends, Atrahasis emerges to find the world transformed. Mountains of corpses, devastated landscape, silence. The text describes him making offerings, and the gods, starved because human offerings ceased, descend like flies to the smell of roasting meat. Enlil is enraged that anyone survived. He demands to know who warned Atrahasis. Enki admits his action, but defends it. Total annihilation was unnecessary. Alternative punishments could have limited population without genocide. A new compact is established. Humanity will continue, but under restrictions, to prevent overpopulation. But here's what troubles close reading of the text. The flood is described with plural mechanisms. Water, yes, but also fire, also poison wind, also something that kills without touching. These details don't align with simple deluge. The Gilgamesh epic flood section, preserved most completely on Tablet C, British Museum K3375, adds further peculiar details. When Utnapishtim, the Gilgamesh version's flood survivor, describes what he witnessed from inside the sealed ark, he mentions that he dared not look out during the catastrophe because the appearance of the storm filled me with terror. What storm is too terrible for even indirect observation? The text describes brightness that illuminates darkness, fire that falls from sky, winds that tear at the earth. These elements together, intense light, atmospheric disturbance, falling fire, suggest something beyond weather. After the flood subsides, Utnapishtim opens the ark's window and looks out. The text describes his reaction. The landscape was level as a flat roof. All of mankind had returned to clay. The phrasing is significant. Not drowned, not killed, but returned to clay. As though unmade, dissolved, reduced to constituent elements. The Eridu Genesis, a fragmentary Sumerian text that provides the oldest version of the flood story, includes one additional disturbing detail. After the flood, when vegetation begins growing again, the text notes that some areas remain barren for extended periods. Not because they're underwater, the water has receded, but because the land itself won't support life. This detail appears in multiple flood traditions. Lingering contamination that prevents immediate return to normal life. The biblical account mentions Noah sending birds to test if land was habitable. Why test if the only concern was water level? Why not simply wait for visible recession, unless something else required dissipation, something not visible, something that made land dangerous despite appearing dry? The mainstream interpretation treats the flood story as mythologized memory of actual catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence confirms major flood events in the region's prehistory. Leonard Woolley found an 8-foot clay layer at Ur separating cultural periods. Similar deposits exist at other sites. Something happened, likely multiple regional floods over centuries, compressed in memory into one catastrophic event. This interpretation is sound archaeology. Floods happened. People remembered. The story grew in retelling, acquiring theological significance and mythological elaboration. But this reading requires dismissing details that don't fit simple flood narrative. The fire from heaven, the evil wind, the lasting contamination, the gods fleeing in terror, the description of Atrahasis and Utnapishtim needing complete sealing, not just waterproofing, but airtight enclosure to survive. One peculiar detail appears in both Atrahasis and Gilgamesh versions, the protagonists are told to seal the boat's door from inside, and this sealing is emphasized as critical. Why? If the threat is water, why must the door be airtight? Why does the text stress that no opening can remain? Unless the threat wasn't primarily water, unless something else, something airborne, something that penetrated unless completely sealed away, was the actual danger. The flood narratives connect directly to the broader pattern of divine weapons use. The texts treat the flood as deliberate deployment of catastrophic capability, not natural disaster. It's decided by divine counsel, executed through specific mechanisms, regretted afterward for its severity. And crucially, the flood marks a break in civilization. The Sumerian king list divides history, antediluvian kings with extraordinary reigns, the flood, post-diluvian kings with normal human lifespans. Before and after, a clear demarcation. Something fundamentally changed. The text described the antediluvian world as having characteristics lost after the flood: greater lifespans, direct interaction with the Anunnaki, more advanced knowledge, cities built according to patterns no longer fully understood. Whether you interpret this as mythology explaining cultural change, as distant memory of climate shift and societal collapse, or as documentation of something more literal, the pattern is clear. The flood text described catastrophic weapons used followed by civilizational reset. And across multiple cultures, not just Mesopotamian, similar stories exist. A great flood, divine judgment, a remnant preserved, new beginning. The consistency suggests either common experience, common catastrophe, or common memory of something that actually occurred. But mythology alone doesn't leave physical evidence. If these weapons were real, if these catastrophes actually happened, we should find traces in the archaeological record. Not just flood layers and destruction strata, but something more specific. We should find evidence of extreme heat, of stones transformed, of cities destroyed in ways that conventional warfare and natural disaster can't explain. And we do. Stones that became glass. In the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, in what is now Pakistan, archaeologists excavating in the 1920s encountered something they couldn't immediately explain. The ancient city, flourishing around 2500 BC and contemporaneous with Egyptian pyramids and Sumerian city-states, showed evidence of sophisticated urban planning, grid layout, advanced sewage systems, standardized brick production, multi-story buildings. But in a specific area designated the central zone, the bricks told a different story. They weren't simply broken or weathered, they were transformed. Surfaces had melted and re-solidified, creating irregular glassy patches. The transformation wasn't uniform, some bricks partially affected, others completely vitrified, still others untouched mere feet away. The pattern suggested localized, intense heat, far exceeding what ancient kiln technology could produce. John Marshall, who led early excavations, documented these anomalies, but offered no definitive explanation. Later excavators confirmed the findings. In some areas, the vitrification extended to street paving and building foundations, stones that should never encounter temperatures sufficient for transformation. The temperature required to vitrify brick, transforming clay minerals into glass, exceeds 1,400 degrees Celsius. Standard building fires reach perhaps 800-900 degrees. Even with fuel-rich conflagration, achieving vitrification requires exceptional circumstances, extreme heat sustained for sufficient duration, or instantaneous temperature spike of extraordinary intensity. The distribution pattern at Mohenjo-Daro is peculiar. The most intense transformation occurs in roughly circular area approximately 150 feet across. Intensity decreases with distance from this epicenter. This radial pattern doesn't match typical fire spread, which follows fuel availability, wind direction, and structural layout. It matches explosive energy release, shockwave radiating outward from central point. For decades, this evidence inspired alternative theories. In 1979, David Davenport published Atomic Destruction in 2000 BC, arguing that Mohenjo-Daro showed evidence of ancient nuclear detonation. He cited the vitrified bricks, the radial damage pattern, alleged elevated radioactivity SATA measurements found no significant elevation, and skeletal remains showing apparent sudden death. Mainstream archaeology rejected this interpretation, correctly noting that no radioactive isotopes were detected above background levels. The skeletal remains were not from a single catastrophic event, but from gradual cemetery accumulation. Vitrification can occur through conventional fire, under specific conditions. Proposing ancient nuclear weapons requires extraordinary evidence. These objections are methodologically sound. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof. Vitrified brick alone doesn't prove nuclear weapons. The absence of radioactive contamination weighs heavily against nuclear interpretation. But in 2021, a team led by University of Alaska Fairbanks published research proposing different explanation, cosmic airburst. Their study, analysing the tall archaeological mound at Abu Huraira in Syria, dated to approximately 10,500 BC, found evidence of vitrified material, melted architecture, and sudden destruction. They attributed this to meteor airburst, atmospheric explosion of incoming space object creating shockwave and intense heat without leaving impact crater. The paper, published in Airbursts and Cratering Impacts, used this mechanism to explain archaeological sites showing extreme heat damage without obvious cause. They specifically mentioned Mohenjo-Daro as potentially similar case. Airburst events are documented throughout history. The Tunguska event in 1908 flattened 800 square miles of Siberian forest through atmospheric shockwave without creating crater. The Chelyabinsk meteor in 2013 damaged thousands of buildings through airburst alone. These events create localized extreme heat, radial damage patterns, and sudden catastrophic destruction, matching Mohenjo-Daro's evidence. This scientific explanation is more parsimonious than ancient nuclear weapons. It accounts for the evidence without requiring technologies that left no other trace. It fits within known natural phenomena, but consider the pattern more broadly. Mohenjo-Daro isn't unique. At Tawli Malian in Iran, identified as ancient Anshan, excavations revealed destruction layer dated to Middle Elamite period, approximately 1500–1100 B. The city suffered catastrophic fire that destroyed massive administrative complex. The archaeologist William Sumner, who led excavations, described the conflagration as extraordinarily intense, hot enough to vitrify some architectural elements. In Scotland and parts of Europe, approximately 60 archaeological sites show vitrified stone fortifications. These vitrified forts date primarily to Iron Age 800 BC 100 C, though some are older. The stone walls show evidence of melting, granite, limestone and other rocks transformed into glassy slag. For over 250 years, archaeologists have debated how this vitrification occurred. Early theories proposed enemy attack using some lost technology. More recent experiments, notably by Vere-Gordon Childe and Wallace Thornycroft in 1937, demonstrated that intense timber fires built against stone walls can, under specific conditions, create enough heat to partially vitrify stone. Childe and Thornycroft constructed experimental walls using techniques from ancient Scotland, built massive timber fires against them, and achieved partial vitrification after burning for hours. This suggested that the forts were intentionally fired, possibly during construction to strengthen walls, possibly during warfare as destruction. But problems remain with conventional fire explanation. Many vitrified forts show no evidence of sufficient timber fuel. The vitrification often occurs on wall exteriors rather than interiors where timber structure would have been. And at some sites, the vitrification extends to bedrock beneath walls, suggesting heat source from above rather than within structure. In 2016, University of Stirling researchers examined several Scottish sites using modern analytical techniques. Their findings confirmed temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Celsius, but couldn't definitively determine whether fires were deliberate construction technique, enemy attack, or accidental conflagration. The pattern across these sites is geographically widespread. Vitrified structures exist in Scotland, France, Germany, and Scandinavia. If this represented standard construction technique, we'd expect uniform distribution. Instead, we find clusters in specific regions during specific periods, as though particular areas experienced particular events. Other archaeological sites show anomalous destruction. At several Bronze Age settlements across the Middle East, excavation reveals sudden abandonment, population vanished, buildings left intact but empty, no evidence of military conquest or gradual decline, just silence. The city of Kish in Mesopotamia shows destruction layer dated to approximately 2350 BCE. Leonard Woolley's excavations found evidence of intense fire, collapsed architecture, and sudden ending of occupation. What puzzled excavators was the heat intensity, sufficient to crack stone foundations and melt metal objects, without obvious fuel source adequate to sustain such temperatures. At Jericho, one of the world's oldest continuously inhabited cities, excavation reveals multiple destruction layers. One, dated to approximately 1550 BC, shows evidence of fire so intense it caused walls to collapse inward. But the city walls at Jericho were massive. Archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon estimated them at 12 feet thick. Conventional fire shouldn't generate heat sufficient to destabilize such structures. The biblical account famously describes Jericho's walls falling, attributed to divine intervention and Israelite conquest. Archaeological evidence confirms walls did collapse catastrophically during Bronze Age, but the mechanism remains debated. Earthquake? Siege? Something else? Each of these sites has mainstream archaeological explanation. Mohenjo-Daro, natural disaster or gradual decline. Vitrified forts, construction technique or warfare. Kish, conventional fire. Jericho, earthquake or military conquest. These explanations are reasonable. They don't require extraordinary technologies or lost civilizations. They work within established historical frameworks. But collectively, the pattern is striking. Across multiple regions, multiple time periods, we find cities destroyed by extreme heat, stones vitrified, populations vanished. The destructions cluster in Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, roughly 3000 BCE to 500 BCE, and in several cases the sites match locations mentioned in Mesopotamian texts describing divine weapons used. Could this be coincidence? Ancient world was violent. Cities burned. Natural disasters occurred. Finding destruction isn't surprising, but finding destruction that consistently exceeds what conventional fire and warfare can explain, that's more difficult to dismiss. Finding it at sites mentioned in texts describing extraordinary weapons, that merits attention. The evidence alone doesn't prove ancient advanced weapons, but it does establish that something caused widespread catastrophic destruction during the period when Mesopotamian texts describe exactly such events. The question becomes, how do we interpret correlation between textual descriptions and physical evidence? Do we dismiss it as coincidence, or do we consider the possibility that the texts document what actually occurred? The Scottish mystery. The Highlands of Scotland preserve one of archaeology's enduring puzzles. Scattered across remote hilltops, approximately 60 prehistoric fortifications show evidence of intense heat that transformed stone walls into glass. These vitrified forts date primarily to Iron Age, built by Celtic peoples between 800 BC and 100 C, though some may be older. The sites are dramatic. Tapo North in Aberdeenshire, at 1,850 feet elevation, has walls where basalt and granite melted into black glassy slag. Craig Fadraig near Inverness shows similar vitrification across massive stone ramparts. Dunmac Sneachan on the Isle of Lewis, Finnavon in Angus, Donegal on the Isle of Bute, Each displays the same phenomenon: stone that shouldn't melt, melted. The conventional explanation, established through experimental archaeology, is that timber-laced walls were subjected to intense fires. The technique is called murus gallicus in Latin sources, a Gallic wall construction using stone, timber and nails. When such structures burn, the timber creates sustained heat that can, under ideal conditions, reach temperatures sufficient to vitrify stone. In 1934, archaeologist Vere Gordon Schild proposed testing this theory. With engineer Wallace Thornycroft, he constructed an experimental wall at Plean Colliery near Stirling using techniques reconstructed from archaeological evidence. They built massive timber fire against it and maintained combustion for several hours. The experiment achieved partial vitrification, supporting the theory that ancient fires could produce the effect. In 1937, Schild and Thornycroft conducted a second experiment at the actual ancient site of Rahoy in Argyllshire using stones from the fort itself. Again, they achieved vitrification through sustained timber fire. This seemed to settle the question. The forts vitrified either through accidental fire or deliberate enemy action designed to destroy fortifications. But problems remained. Not all vitrified forts show evidence of sufficient timber to sustain the extreme heat required. Some sites have vitrification on exterior wall surfaces where timber structure wouldn't have been positioned. At several locations, the vitrification extends to bedrock beneath walls, suggesting heat from above rather than within the structure. More troubling, at many sites, the vitrification is extremely uneven. Adjacent sections show radical differences. One area with stones completely melted into glass, another few feet away showing no heat damage at all. This pattern doesn't match uniform fire spread, but rather suggests targeted, intense heat application at specific points. Some researchers have proposed that vitrification was intentional construction technique, that builders deliberately fired walls to strengthen them. But experiments show vitrified walls are actually weaker than unfired stone. The melting causes cracks and structural weakness. Why would builders deliberately weaken fortifications? In 2016, researchers from University of Stirling examined several Scottish vitrified forts using modern analytical chemistry. They confirmed temperatures exceeding 1,100 degrees Celsius and found evidence suggesting multiple distinct heating events at some sites. The pattern indicated not single sustained fire, but repeated applications of intense heat. Alternative theories have proliferated. In the 1960s, some researchers proposed that unknown weapon technology was used in prehistoric warfare, perhaps directed energy of some kind. This theory gained little traction because it raises more questions than it answers. Who possessed such technology? Where did they get it? Why does it leave no other archaeological trace? Other researchers noted that Scotland's vitrified forts cluster in certain regions and suggested localized conflicts or cultural practices specific to those areas. But similar vitrified structures exist in France, Germany and Scandinavia, suggesting broader pattern. The Celtic peoples who built these forts left no written records. We know them primarily through Roman sources and through archaeology. Roman observers noted Celtic warriors' ferocity, described their fortifications, documented their tribal conflicts, but nowhere do Roman sources mention walls that turn to glass or weapons that melt stone. This absence is telling. If vitrification was standard practice, either construction technique or common warfare method, Roman observers would have noted it. The Romans were meticulous military engineers who studied and documented fortification techniques. Vitrified walls would have warranted mention. The archaeological consensus is that vitrified forts represent isolated incidents, possibly construction accidents, possibly enemy attacks using conventional fire, possibly ritual practices we don't fully understand. Each fort's vitrification is treated as independent local event rather than evidence of broader pattern. But consider timing. Most vitrified forts date to the period between 800 BC and 100 C. This is exactly when Celtic culture flourished in northern Europe. It's also exactly when, according to some interpretations of the archaeological record, major population movements and cultural disruptions occurred across Europe. And it's worth noting, Scottish vitrified forts aren't unique in showing evidence of extreme, unexplained heat. Similar anomalies appear globally. In Turkey, at the ancient site of Atalike 75 bis 5700 Blay, excavations found structures that show localized extreme heating without obvious fire source. In Peru, at Sacsayhuam near Cusco, some stones show surface vitrification that local guides claim resulted from ancient warfare using weapons of the gods. In India, beyond Mohenjo-daro, several Harappan sites show evidence of sudden extreme heat damage. The pattern is global, spanning cultures that had no contact, occurring across millennia. This suggests either completely independent local phenomena with coincidentally similar effects, or similar causes operating across different regions and time periods. Natural phenomena can create extreme localized heat. Lightning strikes can vitrify sand into fulgurites. Volcanic eruptions produce temperatures exceeding 1000 degrees Celsius. Meteor airbursts generate shock waves and intense heat. Any of these could theoretically explain individual sites, but the distribution doesn't match natural disaster patterns. Vitrified forts aren't concentrated in volcanic regions or areas with high lightning frequency. They're distributed seemingly randomly, clustering only by cultural affiliation rather than geological features. What if the answer lies neither in construction technique, nor in conventional warfare, nor in natural disaster, but in the intersection between ancient texts and physical evidence? Mesopotamian texts describe a world where divine beings wielded catastrophic weapons, where conflicts caused widespread destruction, where regions became uninhabitable through deployed technologies. These texts date primarily to 3500 BC. The vitrified forts, the destroyed cities, the anomalous heat damage, they date to the same period. The Celtic peoples who built Scotland's vitrified forts were not literate. They didn't record their own history. But they existed at the tail end of the Bronze Age collapse, a period when civilizations across the Mediterranean and Near East simultaneously failed. Between 1200 BC and 1150 BC, nearly every major Bronze Age civilization experienced catastrophic disruption. The causes of this collapse remain debated. Mainstream scholarship points to multiple factors: climate change, earthquake storms, sea peoples invasions, systems collapse. All are supported by evidence. All contributed. But perhaps there's another factor, one not captured in material record because it doesn't leave obvious traces. Perhaps the technologies described in Mesopotamian texts, the weapons that could level cities and poison lands, were deployed one final time during this period. Perhaps the Bronze Age collapse wasn't purely economic and environmental, but had technological component. This is speculation. It goes beyond what evidence strictly supports, but it connects otherwise disconnected anomalies into coherent pattern. And the pattern extends beyond Scotland, beyond the Mediterranean, to the Indus Valley and beyond. Patterns across continents. In 1922, when John Marshall first surveyed Mohenjo-daro, he wasn't expecting to find advanced urban planning from 2500 BCE. The Indus Valley civilization was barely known to archaeology. Previous excavations at Harappa had revealed some artifacts, but nothing prepared scholars for what Mohenjo-daro represented: a city of 40,000 people with grid layout, sophisticated drainage, standardized brick production, multi-story buildings, public baths, and administrative systems rivaling anything in contemporary Mesopotamia or Egypt. The civilization that built Mohenjo-daro flourished for approximately 700 years, then vanished. Around 1900 BC, the great Indus cities were abandoned, populations dispersed, urban systems collapsed, the civilization never recovered. Why? Mainstream archaeology proposes climate change as primary cause. The Gagahakra river system that sustained the region gradually dried up due to tectonic shifts. Cities dependent on irrigation and trade lost their water supply. Populations migrated to regions with more reliable water. Urban civilization couldn't sustain itself and collapsed into smaller village cultures. This explanation is supported by hydrological evidence, sediment analysis, and patterns of settlement abandonment. It's sound science based on observable data, but it doesn't account for the vitrified bricks. Climate change doesn't melt stone. River drying doesn't create radial destruction patterns with epicenters of extreme heat. Could Mohenjo-Daro have suffered two separate catastrophes, one conventional and one extraordinary airburst or unknown event? Could the destruction evidence date to different event than the final abandonment? The stratigraphy at Mohenjo-Daro is complex. The site shows multiple occupational layers, rebuilding, changes in architecture. The vitrified material appears primarily in late phase contexts, potentially coinciding with or shortly before final abandonment. But here's what connects to broader pattern. Mohenjo-Daro is approximately 7,700 miles east of Mesopotamia. Trade connections existed between Indus and Mesopotamian civilizations. Indus seals have been found at Sumerian sites. Mesopotamian goods appear in Indus cities. They were contemporaneous, interacting civilizations, and both show destruction evidence during similar timeframes. The major Sumerian cities faced catastrophic destructions between 2400 BC and 2000 BC. Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus cities collapsed around 1900 BC. The Bronze Age Mediterranean collapse occurred around 1200 BC. These aren't simultaneous, they're separated by centuries, but they fall within the period when Mesopotamian texts describe divine weapons being deployed, when wars among the Anunnaki reached peak intensity, when the texts describe the land becoming poisoned and uninhabitable. Could there be connection? Tel Abu Sharain, ancient Eridu, considered the first city in Sumerian tradition, shows 18 successive occupation levels. The excavations by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd revealed that the city was continuously rebuilt, each temple constructed directly above its predecessor, maintaining sacred continuity for thousands of years. But around 2000 BC, this continuity breaks. Eridu was abandoned. The temples no longer rebuilt. The city that Sumerian texts identify as where kingship first descended from heaven fell silent. Why? What happened that could end millennia of continuous sacred occupation? The city of excavated by Leonard Woolley, reveals similar pattern. Flourishing during III period 2112-2004 BE, it suddenly collapsed. The lamentation over the destruction of documents this collapse. Woolley's excavations found corresponding destruction layer, massive fire, collapsed walls, sudden abandonment. Was eventually reoccupied during later periods, but never regained its former glory. The destruction marked permanent break in its cultural and political importance. Nippur, Enlil's cult center and Sumer's most sacred city, faced multiple destructions during the 3rd millennium Beak. Each time it was rebuilt, maintaining its religious significance even as political power shifted elsewhere. But archaeological evidence shows the rebuildings became progressively less grand. The city was dying, losing population, declining in importance. Across Mesopotamia, this pattern repeats. Great cities of the early and middle Bronze Age faced catastrophic destructions. Some recovered partially, many didn't. By the end of the 2nd millennium BC, the urban civilization that produced cuneiform literature, mathematical innovations, and administrative complexity had dramatically declined. This decline is well documented in mainstream archaeology. It's attributed to multiple factors: climate stress, collapse of trade networks, invasions, political instability. These are all valid, supported explanations. But they don't explain the specific destruction evidence at individual sites. They don't explain the vitrified bricks, the evidence of extreme heat, the patterns suggesting extraordinary weapons used rather than conventional warfare. Consider the Bronze Age collapse more broadly. Around 1200 BC, within approximately 50 years, the following civilizations simultaneously faced catastrophic disruption. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia collapsed completely, capital Hattusa burned and abandoned, Mycenaean Greece, palace centres destroyed, writing system lost, population declined dramatically. Egyptian New Kingdom, severely weakened, lost control of foreign territories, faced internal instability. Ugarit on Syrian coast, destroyed utterly, never reoccupied. Cyprus, major cities burned. Levantine cities, widespread destruction layers. This simultaneous collapse across vast geographic region has puzzled historians since it was first recognised. The scale suggests systemic crisis, not local catastrophe. Something affected the entire interconnected Bronze Age world simultaneously. Mainstream explanations focus on earthquake storms, climate disruption, sea peoples invasions, and systems collapse. Eric Klein's 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, synthesizes evidence supporting these factors. The explanations are sound and evidence-based. But there's one peculiar detail in the destruction layers at multiple sites. Evidence of extreme fire damage exceeding what conventional warfare should produce. At Hattusa, stone foundations melted. At Ugarit, clay tablets were accidentally baked through extreme heat, ironically preserving them when they should have been destroyed. Could the Bronze Age collapse have technological component? Could the weapons described in Mesopotamian texts have been deployed during this period, contributing to the catastrophic disruption? This is speculation beyond what evidence strictly supports. The mainstream explanations don't require extraordinary technologies. Earthquake, drought, invasion, and systems failure are sufficient causes. But consider what the Mesopotamian texts describe. The Era epic documents weapons that devastate regions, leaving lands poisoned. The Lamentations describe cities destroyed by extraordinary heat and persistent contamination. The flood narratives describe world-altering catastrophe requiring civilizational reset. And across the archaeological record, from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley to the Mediterranean to Scotland, we find physical evidence that matches these descriptions: extreme heat damage, sudden catastrophic destruction, evidence of effects that exceed conventional explanations. The pattern exists. The question is how we interpret it. Do we treat Mesopotamian texts as pure mythology, disconnected from physical reality? Do we view archaeological anomalies as isolated incidents with conventional explanations? Or do we consider the possibility that texts and evidence connect, that the tablets document events that left physical traces we can still observe? Before answering, consider one more factor: oral tradition. Stories persist across generations. Cultural memories preserve, even when details transform. If catastrophic weapons were deployed in humanity's deep past, would we expect to find memory of such events in later traditions? We do. Flood stories appear in virtually every ancient culture. Destruction myths describing fire from heaven, divine weapons, world-ending catastrophe appear globally. Norse Ragnarok describes weapons that crack the sky. Hindu epics describe Brahmastra, a weapon that could destroy regions. Greek mythology speaks of titans wielding catastrophic forces. Could these be independent inventions, each culture creating similar stories for psychological or theological reasons? Certainly, humanity does create myths to explain existence, to process trauma, to teach moral lessons. Or could they be echoes of actual events, filtered through millennia of retelling, transformed into mythology, but preserving core memory of something that actually occurred? The evidence allows both interpretations. The question is which framework better accounts for all the data, texts, archaeology, and global traditions. 3 readings of the same evidence. At this point, you've heard extensive description of Mesopotamian texts documenting divine weapons and catastrophic warfare. You've learned about archaeological evidence of extreme heat damage at ancient sites across multiple continents. You've seen patterns suggesting potential connection between textual descriptions and physical remains. Now comes the essential question: how do we interpret this evidence? 3 primary frameworks exist, each with strengths and limitations. Before drawing conclusions, consider all 3 interpretations fairly. Framework 1, pure mythology. This interpretation, held by majority of mainstream scholars, proposes that Mesopotamian texts describing divine weapons represent mythological explanations for natural phenomena and historical events that ancient peoples couldn't scientifically understand. Under this reading, the Anunnaki are gods, not actual beings, literary personifications of natural forces and human psychology. Weapons like Shurur and the Sabiti represent lightning, storms, earthquakes, floods, and plagues, reinterpreted as divine action. The destructions described in Lamentations document real catastrophes, military conquests, fires, floods, but attribute them to supernatural causes because scientific frameworks didn't exist. The flood narratives preserve cultural memory of actual flooding in Mesopotamia, but mythologize the events with divine judgment. Framework. Archaeological destruction evidence results from conventional causes, warfare, fire, natural disaster, with no connection to mythological texts. This interpretation is methodologically conservative. It doesn't require unknown technologies or lost civilizations. It works within established historical and scientific frameworks. It accounts for how ancient cultures universally attribute natural events to supernatural causes. Samuel Noah Kramer, who translated more Sumerian literature than perhaps any scholar, maintained this interpretation. He saw the texts as invaluable windows into Sumerian thought, religion, and society, but treated them as mythology reflecting cultural values rather than historical documentation. The strength of this framework is parsimony. It doesn't multiply entities beyond necessity. Natural disasters and conventional warfare sufficiently explain the archaeological evidence. Mythology sufficiently explains the textual descriptions. The limitations: this framework requires dismissing specific procedural details in the texts as pure literary invention. It requires attributing consistent patterns across multiple independent texts to convention rather than observation. And it doesn't fully account for why vitrified bricks and evidence of extreme heat appear at sites mentioned in the texts. Framework 2, encoded wisdom. This interpretation suggests the texts preserve philosophical and spiritual teachings encoded in narrative form. Under this reading, the weapons represent not physical objects, but states of consciousness, spiritual forces, or natural laws that ancient sages understood at deeper level than modern materialistic frameworks allow. Under this reading, the Anunnaki represent aspects of cosmic order or psychological archetypes. Divine weapons symbolize spiritual forces, truth, justice, wisdom, destruction of ego, purification through ordeal. The conflicts described represent internal spiritual struggles externalized into mythological narrative. The flood represents spiritual cleansing, death of old self, rebirth into higher consciousness. Archaeological evidence is coincidental or represents events that inspired later spiritual reinterpretation. This framework is common in esoteric traditions, New Age interpretations, and some academic approaches treating mythology as encoded wisdom literature. It allows the texts to carry profound meaning without requiring literal historical events. The strength of this interpretation is that it takes the text seriously as containing important knowledge while avoiding conflicts with scientific understanding. It allows modern readers to find personal meaning in ancient stories. The limitations: this framework is unfalsifiable. Any specific detail can be reinterpreted as symbolic of something else. It requires assuming ancient authors were intentionally encoding hidden meanings, which is possible but unprovable. And it doesn't explain why such encoding would include specific geographic locations, specific artifact catalogue information, and specific procedural details about weapon function. Framework 3. Historical documentation. This interpretation proposes that Mesopotamian texts document actual events, filtered through the conceptual frameworks available to Bronze Age scribes, but fundamentally attempting to record what occurred. Under this reading, the Anunnaki were actual beings, whether advanced humans, survivors of earlier civilization, or something else, who possessed technologies that seemed divine to less advanced contemporaries. The weapons described in texts were actual technologies understood imperfectly by observers who lacked technical frameworks to describe them accurately. The destructions documented in Lamentations and epics were actual catastrophic events employing these technologies. Archaeological evidence of vitrification, extreme heat, and anomalous destruction connects directly to events described in texts. The flood represents actual catastrophe, whether technological, natural, or both, that reset civilization and forced knowledge preservation and retransmission. This interpretation aligns with alternative archaeology movements, ancient astronaut theories, and researchers proposing lost advanced civilizations in human prehistory. The strength of this framework is that it takes the texts at something closer to face value. If ancient scribes said divine beings used specific weapons with specific effects causing specific catastrophes, this reading asks, what if they meant exactly that, describing as best they could what they witnessed? It also accounts for the correlation between textual descriptions and archaeological anomalies. If texts describe cities destroyed by extreme heat, and we find cities with evidence of extreme heat, this interpretation sees causation rather than coincidence. The limitations are severe. This framework requires technologies that left no other archaeological trace, no manufacturing centres, no tool marks, no material culture consistent with advanced capability. It requires explaining why such technology, if it existed, wasn't used more broadly, and why it completely vanished, leaving only textual descriptions and ambiguous destruction evidence. It also faces the problem that modern analysis finds no definitive proof of ancient nuclear weapons or equivalent technology, no radioactive isotopes above background at supposed nuclear war sites, no clear evidence of directed energy or other exotic weapons. The vitrification and extreme heat can be explained through conventional means, even if such explanations require unusual circumstances. Most problematically, this interpretation often relies on Zecharia Sitchin's translations and theories. Sitchin, while popular, is rejected by mainstream scholarship for mistranslating Sumerian, making connections unsupported by actual texts, and proposing interpretations contradicted by archaeological evidence. His work, while influential in alternative circles, doesn't represent accurate scholarship. However, Sitchin's errors don't automatically invalidate all alternative interpretations. Credible researchers can propose that something extraordinary occurred in human prehistory without accepting Sitchin's specific claims about planet Nibiru, gold mining, or genetic engineering. Evaluating the frameworks. Each interpretation has merit. Each accounts for some evidence while struggling with other aspects. The pure mythology framework is strongest scientifically and methodologically. It requires no extraordinary assumptions, but it requires treating very specific textual details as coincidental invention. The encoded wisdom framework preserves meaningful content without historical commitment, but it's unfalsifiable and arguably projects modern interpretations onto ancient texts. The historical documentation framework takes texts seriously as attempted record keeping, but it requires technologies and capabilities for which we lack definitive proof, and it risks seeing patterns where only coincidence exists. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these frameworks. Perhaps the texts preserve memory of actual catastrophes, conventional warfare, natural disasters, but the scale and trauma cause survivors to interpret events through divine action framework. Perhaps some details are literal while others are symbolic. Perhaps ancient peoples witnessed things they couldn't explain and did their best to document it using available conceptual tools. What remains undeniable, the texts exist. The archaeological evidence exists. The correlation exists. How we interpret these facts determines whether we see coincidence, mythology, encoded wisdom, or documentary evidence. The choice, ultimately, is yours. The question that remains. The clay tablets sit in museum cases beneath carefully controlled lighting. Catalogue numbers are fixed. Climate monitored. These fragments of baked earth, pressed with wedges 4,000 years ago, wait patiently for interpretation. In Oxford's Ashmolean Museum, the well-Blundell prism turns slowly in its display case, each face visible in rotation, when kingship was lowered from heaven. 8 antediluvian kings reigning impossible years. The flood, the reset, new beginning. The words are clear. The meaning remains contested. In Philadelphia's University Museum, tablets documenting the lamentation for Ur-Rest in archival storage. The evil wind. The storm that killed without touching. The land made uninhabitable. Survivors warned not to return too soon. Documentation of catastrophe preserved through accident of clay's durability. In London's British Museum, the error tablets describe weapons awakened from dormancy deployed against cities, causing destruction that terrified even the gods who unleashed it. The aftermath described with specificity, regions poisoned, populations vanished, consequences lasting generations. These texts were never lost. They weren't suppressed or hidden. They've been available to scholarship since the 19th century. They've been translated, analysed, published, discussed in academic contexts for over 100 years. Samuel Noah Kramer made them accessible to general audiences in the mid-20th century. They tell consistent story. Advanced beings possessing extraordinary capabilities inhabited Earth during humanity's early history. They wielded weapons that could devastate cities and poison lands. They fought among themselves. The conflicts caused catastrophes that destroyed civilizations and forced survivors to rebuild from fragments of lost knowledge. Whether you interpret these beings as gods, as mythological personifications, as encoded spiritual principles, or as actual entities that once existed, the texts agree on the pattern. And scattered across continents, at sites mentioned in these texts, and at others never documented in cuneiform, physical evidence exists. Stones melted into glass, cities destroyed by heat, exceeding conventional explanations, destruction layers marking sudden catastrophic endings. The correlation between texts and evidence proves nothing definitive. Correlation isn't causation. Pattern recognition can find patterns in randomness. Humans are meaning-seeking creatures who see connections even where none exist. But dismissing correlation requires explaining it away, requires attributing independently arising similarities to coincidence, requires assuming texts describing specific effects at specific locations coincidentally align with archaeological evidence of unusual destruction at some of those same locations. Is that more parsimonious than considering the texts might preserve, however imperfectly, memory of actual events? The question this evidence raises isn't ultimately about nuclear weapons or ancient technologies. It's about how we understand our own history. The standard narrative is linear progress, primitive humans slowly developing agriculture, cities, writing, technology, building toward modern civilization through incremental advancement. The alternative narrative is cyclical, advanced knowledge existing in deep antiquity, catastrophe causing loss, survivors preserving fragments, civilization rebuilding, gradually recovering capabilities that once existed but were lost. The Sumerians themselves believed the second narrative. They consistently portrayed civilization as transmitted, not invented, as maintained, not developed, as recovered after catastrophe, not created from void. Why would they believe this if it weren't true? Why would every ancient civilization describe their knowledge as received from gods or ancestors rather than discovered through their own innovation? Perhaps because they were unsophisticated, lacking scientific method, attributing everything to supernatural causes. Perhaps because they needed mythological legitimacy for political structures. Perhaps because psychological need for meaning creates origin stories disconnected from reality. Or perhaps because it's what actually happened. Perhaps because the oldest human memories, filtered through millennia of retelling, but never completely lost, preserve truth about our past that contradicts modern assumptions. The evidence exists. The texts exist. The correlation exists. What we do with this information, how we interpret it, whether we investigate further or dismiss it as coincidence and mythology, reveals as much about our own assumptions as about ancient history. Consider what lies beneath our cities. Layers of earlier occupation, building upon building, civilization upon civilization. London sits atop Roman Londinium, sits atop earlier settlements. Rome contains multiple cities stacked vertically through time. Every major urban centre is archaeological layer cake, each stratum representing different era. What lies beneath the oldest known cities? Beneath Eridu, beneath Ur, beneath Jericho? How far down does human habitation extend? How much remains undiscovered, buried beneath meters of soil and sand? We've excavated perhaps 1% of known archaeological sites. The vast majority of ancient cities remain buried, unexplored, their evidence unavailable to modern analysis. How much of human history remains literally hidden, waiting for excavation that may never occur? The Sumerian tablets document world far older than their own civilization. They describe antediluvian kings, pre-flood cities, knowledge preserved from earlier ages. They present themselves not as the beginning of human accomplishment, but as inheritors of something older. What if they were right? The question doesn't require ancient astronauts or Atlantis. It doesn't require accepting any specific alternative history claim. It simply asks, is the standard narrative of linear progress from primitive to advanced necessarily correct? Or could human history be more complex, more cyclical, with rises and falls, knowledge gained and lost and regained across vast timescales? The texts suggest the second possibility. They describe catastrophe so severe it resets civilization. They describe survivors struggling to preserve knowledge in fragmented form. They describe later generations trying to maintain traditions they no longer fully understood, copying texts whose original context was lost. This is exactly what we see in the textual record. Scribes copying earlier texts, sometimes making errors that suggest they didn't understand what they were copying. Traditions maintained through rote repetition, even as meaning faded. Knowledge fragments preserved, not because people understood them, but because they were considered sacred, ancient, important. Knowledge preservation after catastrophe. Isn't that what libraries attempt? What archives maintain? What academic institutions protect? We recognise that knowledge can be lost if not carefully preserved. We understand that catastrophe, war, fire, flood, social collapse can destroy accumulated wisdom of centuries. The ancient world faced such catastrophes repeatedly, and perhaps, if the texts are to be believed, face them on scale we can barely imagine. The question that remains is whether we take these texts seriously, not as inerrant truth requiring blind acceptance, but as potential documentation deserving investigation rather than dismissal, as evidence worthy of consideration within broader framework of human history. You've heard the evidence. You've seen the correlation between texts and archaeology. You've considered 3 interpretive frameworks, each with strengths and limitations. The conclusion is yours. Do you see mythology disconnected from physical reality, encoded wisdom requiring symbolic interpretation, or documentation of actual events filtered through ancient understanding? Whatever you conclude, the tablets will continue resting in their climate-controlled cases. The archaeological sites will continue yielding their evidence to patient excavation. The questions will remain, waiting for new discoveries, new interpretations, new frameworks that might better account for all the data. History isn't settled. It's constantly revised as new evidence emerges, as new analytical techniques develop, as scholars ask new questions of old material. What we know about the past changes as our ability to investigate improves. Perhaps future archaeology will discover definitive evidence supporting one interpretation over others. Perhaps analysis will demonstrate conclusively that all anomalies have conventional explanations. Or perhaps we'll find evidence that ancient texts preserved memories of events more extraordinary than current frameworks allow. Until then, the question remains open, and that's appropriate. Not all questions require immediate answers. Some benefit from remaining unresolved, inviting continued investigation, welcoming multiple perspectives, resisting premature closure. The Sumerians, our earliest literate ancestors, left us their tablets. They documented their world, their beliefs, their understanding of history. They did so with care, copying texts across generations, maintaining traditions they considered essential. They described catastrophic weapons and divine conflicts. They documented destroyed cities and poisoned lands. They insisted this happened not in mythic time, but in their own history, in places they could name, leaving consequences they still observed. Whether we interpret this as literal documentation, as mythological processing of natural disaster, or as something between these poles, we owe them the courtesy of serious consideration. They were not primitive or naive. They were sophisticated observers who created writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, literature. When they wrote that cities were destroyed by extraordinary weapons, that lands became uninhabitable, that knowledge was lost and had to be preserved, they meant something. What exactly they meant remains the question, and that question, like the tablets themselves, endures.